This is the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast with your host, Kevin Murray.
Welcome to the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast. On this episode, we have a very, very special guest. Her impact on the fantasy sports industry has been legendary. She's a physical therapist and board-certified orthopedic clinical specialist. As a sports journalist, her work is featured all over the ESPN platform. And of course, she has starred on the Fantasy Focus podcast since 2008. It's an honor to welcome ESPN's injury analyst, Stephania Bell, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you. I've had the chance to meet you a couple times, and you were always so kind and so great to me. And that's that says a lot since I'm a Seahawks fan.
Yeah, I know. Well, we won't. You told me there would be no Seahawks in this.
There might be a couple little things. But your impact on the fantasy sports industry has been such a joy to witness over the years. So let's rewind and start the beginning of your story. So growing up in the Bay Area, were you a big sports fan, a big football fan as a kid?
I was. I mean, I remember watching football from the time I was watching any sport. And both my parents are football fans. It's not just my dad. I think my dad and I have gravitated more towards the 49ers. Growing up in the Bay Area, my mom was a Raiders fan. We all used to go to Raiders games when I was little. But, as little kids will do, I felt jilted when they left and moved to LA. So, we kind of split our loyalties for a while. And then my dad and I went 49ers and never looked back. But football and college football, like a huge part of our television watching growing up. So I've always been a football fan.
And the Bay Area is such a cool place for sports. I went to college down there for chiropractic school, and that exposure to all the Bay Area sports teams, professionally and in college, was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, well, my dad worked at Stanford, so we grew up also going to Stanford football games. And, I saw John Elway playing college football when I was growing up. And so, I really got to see everything there. We, like you said, we're very, very lucky. And it's funny because people will say, California is not a passionate fan base because California is so flaky because like the weather's nice. There might be 25 other options of things to do. But I will say that the true sports fans are pretty passionate. If you go to a Niners game or in the old days, Raiders games, you would know.
So what inspired you to pursue a career in physical therapy?
It's funny, like most people, if you talk to most physical therapists, they'll say, well, I was rehabbing an injury and that's what led me there. And it was along those lines. I wanted to go into medicine since I could remember. And I wanted very specifically to be an orthopedic surgeon. And I'm not sure why that was what I wanted to do, but I think I understood that it would involve, keep me involved with sports. And then in college, I got a work study job working in the training room. And so that really opened my eyes to rehab. I had never been in therapy. I could think of a number of things I should have gone to PT, but back then you didn't really go to PT for a lot of the things you go for now. And so I think working daily with the athletes made me realize I wanted to go more that path versus when they were unconscious and operating on them. I really liked the day-to-day interaction and watching them progress. And so that's what flipped the gears, and that's why I went into PT.
Okay, and you went to Princeton.
I did.
Undergrad, right? And then you ended up going to Miami.
I did. I went to Miami for physical therapy school.
And then you taught at Kansas. Is this all accurate?
Yes, it's all accurate. I've been all over the place.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So College of Princeton, and I wanted to. I tried to walk on the track team there, and I actually trained with them, and I was going to start running indoor track, and I was so excited because I'd never run indoor, and I did track all through high school, not good enough to, I wasn't going to Princeton to run, but once I got there, I thought, well, I think I could, I had an ability to walk on. They let me train with the team, but then I ended up shredding a tendon in my ankle and ultimately needed surgery. And that really cemented me wanting to go into PT, by the way. So never got to do the sports there. And I loved everything about Princeton athletics. Like I said, I was so involved with them in the training room, but I always wanted to go to a school where football was huge. And Miami just happened to have a really good physical therapy program. And if you remember Miami in the late 80s and early 90s, they were pretty good.
Yeah, really good.
It was really fun to go to grad school. And also baseball was really good. We had baseball team in the College World Series. We were playing for national championships in football. Swimming and diving were at the top. It was fun to go to school at Miami then.
Yeah, it must have been a good experience. So what happens if the NCAA tournament, if you got Princeton, Miami, Kansas
I had that
in
this
the
year.
Final Four? So what do you do?
Well, if truth be told, so when I do the bracket, I actually, for whatever reason, think like you can try to win. You ought to, if this year taught us anything, it's that you might as well never actually calculate wins and losses in a bracket. You should just go with whoever your loyalties are to. But I hope nobody from Princeton sees this, but I didn't have them advancing at all. And not because in the past I've had them advancing a couple of rounds, but I just didn't necessarily think they would this time. I had Miami going to the Final Four. So that I had. I was lucky. I wasn't to the point where they were going to be facing each other in national championship, but I did have both schools at least making an appearance in my bracket. I think I had Princeton winning one, but then not advancing beyond that. But of all the story, Miami's story was fantastic, but you had to love Princeton's story and how they, especially after Pete Carril, the legendary coach, had passed away, and he was he was just such a figure in basketball. And the Princeton offense was known by so many people, so I think it was a really big year. They won the Ivies at home. They go to the national tournament and they get noticed. So it was a great showing by them.
Always fun when an Ivy League school moves on, for sure. So when you finished your schooling, where did your career take you?
Well, originally I went back to San Francisco to work, and it's funny when you've been around as long as I have. You have to find ways to sort of condense the story because there's a lot. The path is it veers. It makes a lot of turns. But I wanted to go into manual therapy and get into orthopedics and sports. So I worked in a broader outpatient setting, getting some manual therapy training, and a teaching position opened up at Kansas. You mentioned it was one of my former professors had taken over as the chair of the program there. So I had an opportunity to go teach and work at a D1 school, D1 athletics in the sports medicine center. So I took it, and that was phenomenal. And I got a lot of experience working with D1 athletes. So that was, something that I hadn't obviously I'd worked in the training room at Princeton. I traveled with the teams and all that, but this work, again, talking about hoops, you're talking about my bracket. I also had Kansas in my bracket. I actually had Kansas going to win the whole thing. We know how that turned out.
Yeah.
But Kansas basketball, that was like working in a sports medicine setting with a team that everyone in the state has their attention on. Like, that was probably the biggest team in the state. The Chiefs are Missouri technically, even though they're both. But so I think that gave me kind of even more of an incentive to want to be working with elite athletes. And then I went back to the Bay Area to practice after that. And as the fantasy sports writing took off, my career, as you know, took a turn, and I went more heavily media and less clinical.
Yeah. So when did you first discover fantasy football?
I was playing it right after I left Kansas City, and that was 99. So I started playing in a co-ed league, and some of my PT friends were playing in it. A couple of them were really into it, and they convinced me to join this league. And the league I was in, actually, there were, I think, 3 of us who were PTs, 3 of all the women in the league. So it was a co-ed league. The women were the PTs. I probably talked the most. And so, people were asking me about injuries quite a bit. And that's, between that and seeing how competitive it was, seeing how much fun it was still, to this day, is probably one of my favorite leagues I've ever been in. And it just, that kind of showed me that there was number one, a huge passion for fantasy football, and it was only going to get bigger, not smaller. And I felt like it was going to grow and grow and grow. That's pretty much happened. And then just the people want an edge on information. That became apparent very quickly. And injuries, there was just not much there. And I thought, well, there's a hole. It needs to be filled. So when people start asking you questions and think that you have some insight that's going to help them, and you start seeing that, I don't think the leap was that great. I think anyone would have done it, but I figured I could probably monetize that. And there were a lot of people who didn't think I could make that leap. So that even incentivized me a little more, I think.
Oh, I bet. So you realize there's a niche that you could fill potentially in sports media and in the fantasy industry. How did you go about pursuing that?
It was a lot of just just pitching the idea casually to friends I was playing fantasy football with. And then one of the guys in my league, actually, he and his brother were making draft boards. And at that time, they were selling their draft board kits. They were making them for ESPN. So just seeing somebody else have a business that was funneling right to one of the major sports outlets showed me that there was a pathway. And as the fantasy industry was growing, he said, why don't you come with me to it was the FSTA, then it's FSGA now, Fantasy Sports and Trade Association at the time. He said, why don't you come to a meeting and just, I'm going for my business. Come with me. I'll introduce you to some people and start chatting with them. And that's really what it was. I was just walking around trying to network with people. And back then, you've been to FSGA meetings, haven't you?
Yeah.
But back then, the FSTA, it was tiny. Like there were less than 100 people, I'm sure. And certainly no women, like maybe 2 or 3. I don't remember seeing any. I got enough interest from people who were there that I felt like it was something to continue to try and pursue. It was just that nobody really had an idea of how to get it done or where to put me. And then eventually a little outfit called KFFL gave me a tiny space inside somebody else's column to write. And after doing that for part of a football season, RotoWire approached me. I started working for them, and that kind of grew my writing audience. And then they began a Sirius XM show, and that got me doing on-air stuff. So all of those things together, and I met Matthew Berry, and he went to ESPN, and he was tasked with building the fantasy talent group there, and conversations, one thing led to another, and I got invited out for an audition and basically never left.
The rest is history. No, that's cool. That's how you ended up. Yeah, that's how you ended up getting to ESPN. That's amazing. So what's your experience been like at ESPN all these years?
Well, it's certainly the most dynamic, interesting place I've ever worked. And I am somebody who gets bored easily. I think that's why I was always looking for it's why I loved PT. Originally everything was different every single day. This, people walk in to your office, they come in the clinic, and it's always a challenge, right? You're faced with something new every single day. No two things are exactly the same. I think, at least for me, I think that's what makes a good practitioner, right? Is if you approach everything fresh. And, but even then my mind was always looking for different things to do. And this was a great combination of me being able to write, which I really like to do, and to talk about injuries and educate people, which is something else I really like to do. That combination of the academic stimulation of being in an environment that was new to me. I'm not a journalist by training, so I had to learn a lot. I felt like I was always studying when I got to ESPN, and people were so gracious and kind, and the news department helped me a lot. And I brought ideas and a very specified area of content knowledge, and they helped me learn the ropes of how to do things in that environment. So I don't think my job has really stayed the same. It's switched, and as our sports rights emphasis has switched, now we do a lot more NBA, less baseball. I used to do a lot of baseball, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So I do miss that, but I've kind of followed where our interests have leaned with ESPN, and just tried to capture stories. I really like the storytelling now. That's how the Alex Smith thing came to be. So I've really enjoyed getting to work on different stories and different topics besides just who got hurt today and how long are they going to be out,
Yeah, that Alex Smith content was amazing stuff that you did with that for sure.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's all the credit to Alex and to
Yeah.
Dr. Robin West, because without them, there was no way for me to tell the story. So, one of the hardest things to do in this job is convince people to give you access, and there's a lot of trust involved. And I worked with a phenomenal producer. The E60 team is amazing at storytelling. I think, all their work is so good. And so it was just a perfect combination of everything. But I do think that, this Alex's story moved people because nobody really realized what he'd been through. And so I always like that peek behind the curtain, and people see how much some of these athletes go through to come back from injury. I like being able to share that.
Yeah, and that's something that is missed so often, is you don't realize everything that happens behind the scenes. It's extraordinary, and that content was captivating for sure. So what have you enjoyed the most when it comes to your Fantasy Focus podcast experience?
I think the banter. My favorite shows are when we have really good back and forth exchanges that are effortless. It's because every year it's sort of this, there's basic elements in fantasy football that we're always looking at. Who do you draft first? Where do you rank these players? How many games do you project for them? All the stats of it. But part of the reason I think the podcast has been so enjoyable and why it's survived so long is just our conversations, and trying to present that information in a way that's entertaining, hopefully, for the people who are listening / watching now, because everything is video now too. I think the hardest part is knowing we have a 1 hour fixed time. Back when we had a regular podcast, we could sort of do whatever we wanted, chat, go long, go short. But now we're a show that starts on the hour and ends on the hour. And so trying to make sure that we deliver the content people are looking for and also have fun while we're doing it. You hope that it doesn't ever come across looking like work, but there is some work involved to make sure you're hitting all the points and still trying to have fun with it,
So during your career, how much have the medical staffs of professional sports teams changed over time?
Yeah, I think, it's not so much the, as there's always evolution of techniques, whether it's on the surgical side, things are always improving. Equipment's improving, technology's improving. There's more technology on the modality side in terms of rehab, things that are available for rehab. I think blood flow restriction training's had a huge impact. But I think like the biggest changes are globally, some of the things that are being considered when it comes to medical care that weren't before. Mental health and how much that impacts recovery. And mental health is such a broad topic. And I think, whatever it conjures up for people is probably different from one person to another. But it can be as global as, mental health issues that are sort of predominant in a person's life, or just the specific aspect of mental recovery from an injury to allow an athlete to return to the previous level of performance. Something that I don't think on the rehab side, we probably gave enough attention to in the past. And I think that's being integrated more and more into return to play. And then performance. I think all the metrics that are available now for athletes to be able to measure their own performance and see the baseline data and compare that, especially as they're recovering, they can see how close they are getting back to their original level of performance. That whole world has changed dramatically. A lot of it was a guessing game before. How do you feel? Oh, I feel pretty good. Yeah. Okay, well, we could try this. We had very few tests to return to play, and we still are really lacking in that area in a lot of ways. There's no, as definitive test that says you are ready to go back after your ACL tear. But I think now people are looking at a broader range of things than they were before. Whereas before there were maybe 2 or 3 things you go, okay, you're as good as you're going to get. So get back out there. And I think it's just much more thoughtful now.
Yeah. Well, obviously 2023 was an alarming year from a healthcare perspective on the field with some of the events that took place with Damar Hamlin and Tua Tagovailoa concussion incidents. How will those events impact the game of play and protocols next season?
I don't know that we fully know yet. I do think starting with the Damar Hamlin situation, there's not an easy way to say this, but I'm obviously just, as a PT, incredibly grateful that Damar Hamlin survived and is clearly thriving and working his way back, coming back to football. But I'm also happy for the people who provided him care that night, that the outcome was so positive, because as you know, but maybe most people who, if you don't have a medical background, wouldn't think, if the outcome weren't so positive, you might assume that things weren't done properly. But we know that you can do all the things the right way and still not have a great outcome. So the outcome being what it was avoided a lot of trauma for everybody involved. And I think it's almost a relief in that way, because everybody did do the right things. Now, are there little tweaks to the EAP protocols? Perhaps. I haven't heard anything specific yet, but I think as we get closer to the season, we might hear a little bit about that. I think if anything, it reinforces how important those rehearsals for the emergency action plans are, that everybody knows what they're doing. So I think if there was anyone who was taking it casually before, and I don't think anybody consciously was, but I'm going to bet that every team, when they have their rehearsals this year, people are going to be locked in. And then as far as situation with Tua, I think that forced a slight change in the language of the concussion protocol, that it happens on game day in terms of decision making with regards to a player returning to the field. So if a player demonstrates any kind of ataxia, which is basically an abnormal gait, then they will not be returned that day. Before it was really left to the team evaluating him if it was of neurologic origin or not. And that came from a place where a player who had an orthopedic injury had gone down on the field. This is a couple of years ago, and there was some debate as to whether it was a head injury or orthopedic. Turned out he had an orthopedic injury. So they were trying to allow for that possibility for a player to return. I think people forget that, you got players lobbying to not be taken out of the game unnecessarily, and worried about how that could impact, their career if they're out. People might think, well, that's dramatic, they're out for the rest of one game. But for players on the fringe, certainly those things are all very real. There was a goal to not remove players unnecessarily, but then something like the events with Tua happened, and so you go, okay, we're going to get a little more conservative now. And I think the big takeaway is that everybody should keep in mind is that these processes are dynamic. This medicine and science and protocols and all of it, it's not perfect. And I think they are doing the best job that they can to try and manage medical guidelines and protocols for serious situations in a game where things like that are going to happen. And I think the best part of what happened in the case of Tua's situation, aside from, the caveat being that he's healthy now and he's going to continue to play. We know that. We know he's talked about doing some martial arts in the off season to help, learn how to fall differently and et cetera. But I think the fact that we see that the conversations happen and the protocols change that quickly, that's a good thing, because it's a response to an event where it highlighted maybe there was something that did need to change.
Yeah, for sure. You've inspired so many people to dive into the fantasy sports industry and contribute content. And there's so many more websites and resources out there that are just dedicated to injury analysis. How does it make you feel to see that people getting into the industry, or sites getting developed specifically for injury analysis?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, it's funny because when I first got to ESPN and we're coming up with my bio, and they were asking me if I would join a show, like, well, what do we call you? How do we introduce it? Because I was hired as a writer. So my hiring title was senior writer, but I also had this very specific role, which was to talk about medical content. And I wasn't a reporter per se. My goal, and anybody who knows me knows this, is not to break news. I mean, I think I've done it like 3 times since I've been there. It just so happened something fell in my lap, but I'm not a newsbreaker. I'm a consumer of the information who then provides analysis. And I really learned this by kind of looking around at ESPN, and I saw, there were reporters and then there were analysts, and a lot of the analysts are tied to a specific sport. So, football analysts and basketball analysts and baseball analysts. And I was like, well, I'm an injury analyst. Like, that's what I do. So we came up with that term. And now it's like, if you Google it, I mean, that's what people are calling themselves, as injury analysts. So yeah. I take a little pride in that I think we coined that, and I should have trademarked it. That's what I should have done.
For sure. No, I mean, most sites, most legitimate brands in the industry, like, they have an injury analyst on their staff. And that is, I think the vast majority, probably 100%, would attribute your accomplishments and your inspiration to how they ended up what they're doing, where they are. So,
well, I don't know about that, but I will take credit for the term, because as far as I know, I mean, there was no one else who was doing it, and I still think that I'm the only person who does this full time. I may be wrong, because there may be a couple other people. The fantasy industry has opened up enough that there may be a couple other people who are now doing this full time, but that was also, I think one of the things that was important for me when I did switch, and there was some decision making involved, because initially I was still functioning as a clinician, and I was actually even commuting East Coast, West Coast for a while. But it became clear that if I wanted to do more at the network, and I did, that I would have to move to the East Coast. So I did that. And that I wasn't going to be able to keep up with the teaching and the clinical practice. So I did some consulting for a while so I could still keep my hands in it. But now I'm pretty much just full-time with ESPN and not doing clinical practice. I still stay involved. I keep my license. I go to conferences. I speak. I consume the literature voraciously. I'm at a number of medical meetings, but I'm not actually seeing patients on a regular basis.
Yeah. So when it comes to just applying, the analysis to your roster management in fantasy football, are there certain injuries that just give you pause? You obviously hear about people who are afraid of, a previous Achilles tendon injury, or someone who's, 1 year post ACL, or 2 years post ACL. There's a lot of different scenarios that people might be concerned about. You are the leading expert in the industry when it comes to this type of analysis. What gives you pause?
Well, first of all, I'll always provide the disclaimer that it really depends on the athlete and their particular situation. And as much as I know about the injury and what their rehab path was, because as you know, you could take 2 folks who have an ACL tear, and even if the ACL tear, I'll tell everybody the ACL tears are all different. There's a whole slew of things that can, you can have concomitant injuries. You can have all these other factors. What kind of graft did they use? What was their knee like when they had the ACL tear? But if I know what their rehab path was like, that is important to me, because even 2 people who have a very similar injury can have very different progressions. And part of that could be, their own biology, how they heal, could be where they chose to rehab, could be some things that happened in their life that complicated their rehab, so I think one of the things I get frustrated by in our space is just this notion that, like, oh, it's an ACL, this is how long it takes. I mean, everybody gets reduced to what the injury is and how long it should take. And while I think the rough approximations are fine, they're not all alike. In fact, they're rarely exactly alike. So that's my big disclaimer, which is why some people with a seemingly minor injury, if I have big reservations about it, probably means that I'm aware of something that made me a little more skeptical about how they're progressing. But beyond that, these multi-ligament knee injuries are one of the most complex things to come back from. And again, it depends on the position. When I see a running back who has a multi-ligament knee injury, I get really concerned, like the Javonte Williams situation this year. Not because they can't come back. And certainly some of the surgeons who are fixing these things are phenomenal. And the athletes are obviously, the top echelon of athletes that you'll see. But a running back puts a certain kind of wear and tear on their knee, a certain kind of demand, a stress demand on their knee that's different than if they were a quarterback. And I worry about not only how their progression is, but what their career arc is going to be. And if they put too much pressure on themselves to come back too quickly, I think that's the unspoken part that most people don't see is even though the coach speak will be, well, we're not putting a timeline on it, or there's an implied pressure, whether the team is saying it or not, for week one. There just is. And the players are going to put that on themselves, unless you're like in a Kyler Murray situation where, because of when it happened, that you're really looking into the season, if at all. But everyone else, there's sort of this gray area of like, no, we won't push him. But then it's like, oh, hey, football is around the corner. And they feel it because the team's getting ready and everyone's talking about whether they're going to be able to come back. And there's a point where, biology has to happen. And biology is not on an ahead of schedule type of thing. You can do all the right things in rehab. You can be the best rehabber in the world, but there's a certain amount of biology that has to happen at its own pace. And so I worry for the guys who try to come back too quickly. And the multi-ligament knees to me are one of the least predictable, hardest to project in terms of not only how they'll be when they first come back, but what their career arc will be. And, some of the other big ones, patellar tendon ruptures, Achilles ruptures, even though we've gotten better and guys are coming back and playing again, they're often not coming back to their prior level of performance, or if they do, they're not sustaining it for very long. So we still have a ways to go there.
So when you construct a roster, are you always thinking about injury histories with players?
Yes.
Yeah, I would imagine that to be the case.
Yes.
So
it's always a part of it. Just can't help it. That's always,
Yeah.
It's going to be my bias. It hurts me sometimes. I mean, it's not like I don't see the people commenting about how ridiculously over conservative I am, or, when people will say an unnamed injury, and, and I know exactly who they're talking about, but because I'm the one who put out there that I was really concerned about J.K. Dobbins last year. And I don't bring that up just because he struggled at the beginning. There was actually real legitimate reasons to be concerned. And those clues were there from the coach at when they were in OTAs. It wasn't like it was some magical thing. And it never means that I don't want someone to come. If they prove me wrong, fantastic. Because for me, it's just, I'll take some hit on social media, but if the player's better, I'm a PT. So that's a win.
Yeah.
I worry sometimes that they are trying to push to come back too quickly. So I tend to be a little bit more conservative on where I think they should be versus what they're trying to do.
Makes all the sense in the world. Let's dive into some rapid fire questions. I'll throw out a question. Just give me what first comes to mind.
I'm never ready for these. I don't do anything rapid
You're
anymore.
not. Well, they don't have to be that rapid. What do you love most about fantasy football?
Winning.
I like it. Hey, that's the name of the game. What's your all-time favorite memory from a home fantasy league?
Oh gosh, it's so funny. I was thinking about this. I was like, I don't know that I have like a single memory. We didn't do that league I was talking about that I really loved that I played in. We didn't do like crazy punishments, but I have to say it's just the names. And I remember when TJ Hushmanzada was playing, like, I think my favorite year was the year that all of the different, different ways you could wrap a team name around his name. I mean, I still giggle about like, who's your mama and
Yeah.
who's Manzilli and all the, it was so funny. And I think that is what I love the most. That and it's just the camaraderie with old friends when you're playing with old friends and the constant banter and people giving each other grief. Like there's really nothing like it. I don't have a single favorite memory, but it's like, that's what I hold on to is just all that banter during the season back and forth.
Yeah, it's the foundation of this great game, that league experience. So what is your favorite craziest last place punishment that you've seen?
Well, it has to be these tattoos. I mean, that was Matthew Barrett, but it wasn't me. I didn't play in any league like that. And there was a joke that we were talking about it. We were doing the podcast in the early days that I was going to do that league with them, but I just wasn't sure I could ever bring myself. I thought, I can't come in last. But then I thought, well, just when you think you can't,
Yeah.
There's nobody in that league who's trying to come in last. But I think the tattoo that somebody else picks out because it's so permanent. So permanent. I mean, the Waffle House one I'm enjoying that because that's kind of taken on a life of its own nationwide. So I will travel to other states and people are doing their Waffle House punishment, the 24 hours in the Waffle House.
Yeah.
Which is that really a punishment? I think that's funny.
I mean,
but I think anything where there's permanence is it's hard to top that kind of punishment because you can endure anything, a bad picture, the bad trophy for a year, all that is fine. But man, a tattoo, like you're never going to forget how you came in last.
You will not. You will always be
And
reminded
it won't
of that
age
one.
well, no matter what.
Absolutely not. Who's your all-time favorite 49er?
Well, everyone who knows me well knows that I always loved Ronnie Lott. I always wanted I wanted my number to be 42. I wanted to play safety. That was like if in our college intramural football, I wanted to be on defense, that's so bizarre. Like, why would I want to be on? I just loved his game. I was watching a classic 49ers on NFL Network. They were showing some of the old NFC Championship against the Cowboys, and Cowboys fans out there, like when the Niners beat them and with the catch in 81 and it's showing old Super Bowl games. And it's just so, I love that era. So Ronnie Lott is probably at the top with Jerry Rice, a pretty close second.
That's an easy one. Yeah, for sure. Who's your all-time favorite Seahawk?
Next question.
Okay, next question. Who's winning the NFC West?
Richard Sherman after he left.
Oh,
and became a 49er. Yeah.
I will say Cam Chancellor definitely had some Ronnie Lott type vibes. Right?
Yeah, that's true. But I don't want anybody dishing it out that's not on my team.
No, especially when he's doing it to Vernon Davis, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what are your favorite activities off the clock?
It's sad, but my dog Rico, as everybody knows, he is my little angel that I adopted since the pandemic. So pretty much doing things with Rico, but I have, it's like I enjoy trying to stay somewhat healthy and fit somewhat, it gets harder the older we get. But so I have a class that I do that is boxing. My dad was boxer. So I really enjoy the boxing and, this simple stuff. My favorite, like perfect night for me is good dinner, good wine, good conversation. So
that's perfect. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've been accused of gallivanting around the globe, in the past.
Yes, I have. Boondoggling, I think, is what Matthew used to call it. All lies, but yes.
Yeah. So what are your top 2 favorite places that you've ever traveled to?
Well, one of the boondoggles, according to Matthew, was Monaco, and that was outstanding. I was there. It was a sports medicine conference, and I didn't get to go. I was supposed to speak at the last one. After I went the first time, I was then going to go and speak, and then the pandemic happened, and they canceled. They canceled like 2 weeks before we went, and so I didn't get to go. But there is one of those coming up next year, and I might just have to go back. So. when work's involved, that's been the best. That's been the best trip.
I love it. What are your thoughts on the Scott Fish Bowl?
I can't say enough about Scott Fish and what he's done for the industry, and to what he's done for the industry by making sure people in the industry are doing for others. And I think the whole Fantasy Cares concept and putting all of these efforts towards charity and the work that he does to create it, to make this now this coveted thing that people want to get into the Scott Fish Bowl so badly. It's like the golden ticket from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. It's like, how do I get my ticket to get into the Scott Fish Bowl? And I think it's great. And I've enjoyed playing because I've been really lucky. The people I've met in the league, we always have a chat group going during the season, and met some really nice people that way. And I think the combination of having people who are in the industry and fans, and it's yeoman's work, but what he's done to really create this big global game that has all these people involved, and he runs it. It's so seamless how it all works. I don't know how he has the energy to keep doing it, but I hope he keeps doing it for a long, long time because it's fantastic.
It is true.
Now, I was just upset that I so close. I was in the finals, and I forget when I got knocked out last year. I can't remember if last year or the year before. No, the year before I made it a little bit further, but it was so close.
The playoffs, those later rounds, it's intense. It's
intense. And there's nothing you can, in the bite because, there's no trades and stuff. And there's slim pickings. Like you have to have some luck by the time you're getting down to that point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Lots of fun for sure.
Mm-hmm.
What's been the most difficult challenge in your career that you've faced thus far?
That's a hard one. I don't know that there's one that jumps out at me. I just think that I've had to get used to hearing no a lot more than hearing yes. And I think for people who think like you just walk in and everything's handed to you and then it's great. It's like, no, it's constantly, whether it's pitching a story. And I think this is going to be there's just so many reasons why we have to tell this story, or this is so cool on this medical front. People will find it interesting. And producers are like, no, we're not. We don't think people will find that interesting. And so sometimes you have to, you pick your spots and you find your places where you battle, and some of those end up being wins. And I've gotten to do some cool stuff. But I think whether it's internal, where you pitch ideas, or external, where you're trying to get a player for a piece that you want to do and you can't get them, or you're trying to access something that you can't. There's a lot of no that happens before you get a yes. But there were a lot of no's about me going into fantasy football before I got a yes. So I always tell people, I'm highly motivated by the word no, especially if there's not really a good reason. Like it's just, well, no, you can't, no, because I said so, like that.
Yeah.
That doesn't go over with me so well. So I have no problem with, I've gotten a lot thicker skin working in the media, that is for sure. But it comes from that too. It comes from having to justify things and pitch things more than once. And like I said, getting turned down more easily than things get accepted.
How does that make you feel to see more and more women contributing in the fantasy sports industry?
Oh, that goes without saying. It's phenomenal. There was a long time where there were very, very few, just a couple of us out there. And now, everywhere you turn, people are adding women. I almost think that it's flipped a little bit to where people feel like they're missing something, which, by the way, they are, but they're missing something if they don't have a woman on their staff, because there's just different perspectives, and just, I think, a more diverse, it's not only the audience, I think the community of fantasy is more diverse now in many ways than it was when I was first playing. And so I think the industry people need to reflect that. So I'm glad to see more diversity all across the board.
Makes sense for sure. Name the first three people. Well, this is tricky, but name a few people that come to mind that you just truly admire in the fantasy industry.
Well, I have to say Matthew Berry, because as I told you, without Matthew, there's no me at ESPN. So it goes without saying that he, single-handedly probably had the biggest role in kind of taking me from one walk of life to another. But running a pretty close second is Peter Schenke at RotoWire, because and Chris List too, because at the time Chris was really more involved. I mean, he's stepped away now, but Chris became like he was the yin to my yang. I mean, he was my editor, and we also did the radio together, and it was some of the best banter I've ever had, from that point to now. Hard to find as good chemistry as I had with Liz, and just ping-ponging back and forth. It's very tricky to find someone that you can go toe-to-toe with, but it's so clear that you respect each other. And yet you can argue like crazy. But and this is a skill set, I think, that is lost in general in society. But within the fantasy industry, it's normal to have disagreement. We shouldn't all agree. But there is a way to have this discourse that can be very back and forth, and you can strongly disagree and still have great respect for one another. So Peter hired me. Chris is who I worked with largely, but the two of them together elevated me to the point where Matthew wanted to bring me to ESPN. So really, without them, I certainly wouldn't have been at ESPN. And my third person I was going to say was, because I kind of put Chris and Peter together.
That's okay.
Was Scott Fish, just because of everything he's done. And I don't know that there's anybody else who's done more to shine a light on how good, that fantasy can be a good thing, and there's a lot of benefit besides the obvious joy that we all get out of playing fantasy football.
Yeah, I mean, the fantasy community is so special, and guys like Scott Fish definitely do a great job bringing people together. So I love those answers. Now, do you have any advice for people that are aspiring to get more involved in the fantasy sports industry?
Gosh, I think things have changed so much. I'm not sure my advice is the best, because I'm not hiring those people. So to be fair, I don't know exactly what people are looking for. And originally I was trying to get into a situation where I could get things published, and there wasn't that much that was online. And now look at online, like everybody's online and everything is online, and people can create their own content and post their own content. Look at your podcast that you're doing. I mean, people can do their own thing and get their stuff out there. So I think if I could generalize, it would be to, you can always have high aspirations, but understand that putting in the time and the effort before, you may not get to an ESPN or Yahoo on your first try, but if you are putting out good content and you are engaging with people and you're engaging with other people in the fantasy community, trying to learn from them, and using any feedback that you get to integrate it into your content, that's what builds the case for you to get your foot in the door at the next place and the next place, and so on and so forth. So I think that, and just trying to be authentic, which I feel like that's not authentic because everybody says it, but to find your own voice and where you're comfortable, not to try to replicate what someone else is doing, because at the end of the day, we're all talking about fantasy football. So it can be a lot of things that sound the same. So if you have unique takes or perspectives, then lean into that, because those are the things that will make you stand out.
For sure. So what does your summer schedule look like as we ramp up before the season? Are you visiting training camps or anything like that this year?
I hope to be. It's funny because you think like things would be locked down, but it's not really how it works. Everything's last minute. I'm working on a couple other projects. I've got fantasy football, but I'm also working on a couple other things for NFL related. I've got a UFC related project I'm in on, and then I'm working on some more global issues in sports medicine. And so it's like a lot of irons in the fire, and the timelines are sort of driven by the events that take place in the news world and so forth. So that's as much as I can say about all these different things I'm working on. But in terms of fantasy specifically, we're doing our Fantasy Focus podcast once a week right now on Wednesdays. We do it live 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern on Wednesdays, on the ESPN app and on Twitter and YouTube and all of those good places. And then we will start going daily, typically at the end of July. We'll do our fantasy football marathon in mid-August sometime, which we, do every year. And, as far as I know, we're rolling into fantasy football now on Sundays when the season begins, and we're right back at it.
There we go. So is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to say before we close things out?
Oh, I think we went back. We went in the Wayback Machine to like when I was in college. So I think we've covered it all. I guess I would ask you, like, now that, because you're clearly now doing more in this space than you did originally, what motivated you to start your own podcast?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, my experience going to Bristol when I won Commissioner of the Year was a huge deal for me. I was obsessed with fantasy, playing the game since probably 1995. Obviously, as the commissioner, I was a little bit over the top in my love for just making the experience fun for my league, and that led me to just do everything I could for making the league experience fun, and that got me some of the attention. Obviously, the Commissioner of the Year deal, but with that, I never really I didn't realize how many people were out there contributing in fantasy, and so I was always stuck with the analysts and the information from the apps that I played the game on, right? So, and I was obviously busy, professionally and all that, to a point where I love fantasy, but that experience, I was really embraced by so many people in the community that I was open to this whole new world of fantasy, the fantasy industry. And so, just wanting to give back, I decided to come up with a way to do that. And so, creating the website fantasyfootballunlimited.com, it basically has every category imaginable of fantasy resources. And so I created that, again, inspired from that trip to Bristol. The way that you guys treated me, the experience that we had was so inspiring. And I thought, I love this game so much, I got to do more in it. So,
well, that's great. I mean, that makes me feel good that your experience in Bristol was that impactful.
It was.
But it's, I think that's the ultimate, right? Is giving back to the game that you really enjoy and the community that you really enjoy. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And then from there, we went to the NFFC, that National Fantasy Football Convention, saw you there too. And it was those experiences that just got me more connected with just so many people in the industry. And so, I really want to help bring exposure to people in the industry that consumers of fantasy might not know even exist. The average person that plays fantasy doesn't know about Scott Fish, right? And I think that's a tragedy. I think that everyone should know about the great things that happen in such a great game, because I feel like fantasy, it just makes life more fun. It connects you with your friends and family and league mates. So the more you have fun playing fantasy, I think your life is going to be better, really.
Yeah. Well, I like that you're promoting that, because we want the industry to be around for a long, long time. It's good for all of us.
Absolutely. That's my pleasure. So, obviously, Stephania, it's been an absolute joy to have you on the podcast. Wish you all the best in the season ahead.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and continued good luck with your podcast and your website. And it's nice to see you doing all this for the industry.
Thank you so much, Stephania.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Football Unlimited podcast. Until next time, be sure to follow and subscribe to all of FFU's social media accounts for daily content.